What if someone you loved vanished? Not in mystery, but in plain sight. It begins with a red canoe and a sea that swallows everything. March 2002. The North Sea howls against the English coast, indifferent to the man paddling into its cold grasp. His name, John Darwin, a prison officer, husband, father, and in a matter of hours, a ghost. When the wreckage of his canoe washes ashore, it confirms everyone's worst fear. The sea has claimed another soul. His wife, Anne, mourns. His sons grieve. The town wraps itself in shared sorrow. Newspapers speak of loss. The insurance pays out. The world moves on. But behind a wardrobe, hidden by drywall and denial, John Darwin is still very much alive. He has not gone far. Just next door, in fact, to a house the couple bought in secret, connected by a concealed door. For 5.5 years, John lives as a phantom among the living, watching his own funeral coverage on TV, hearing his children cry through the walls, and doing nothing. Anne plays her part with aching precision. A widow in black, a mother clutching urn and memory. She smiles, she cries, she lies. Even dates again to complete the illusion. No one suspects. Not her neighbors, not her sons, not the insurance companies. What kind of love chooses deception over honesty, performance over pain? The longer the lie lives, the more it demands. In 2007, they planned to start over. In Panama. A new country, a new name, a canoe rental business, with irony lost on them both. But greed is a poor traveling companion. John needs a visa. For that, he needs an identity. So he does something astonishing. He walks into a London police station claiming amnesia. He expects sympathy. Instead, he triggers suspicion. Soon after, the world sees what undoes them. A single photograph from Panama showing John and Anne together, years after his death. It's all the proof investigators need. The hoax shatters. Their sons, victims of the ultimate betrayal, never speak to them again. The Darwins were not criminal masterminds. They were ordinary people who built an extraordinary lie and lived inside it. What they constructed wasn't just a fraud. It was a tomb where trust, love, and truth were buried together. This is how our journey begins, with a man who faked his death and stayed to watch, with a woman who grieved publicly and schemed privately, and with children who learned that grief can be manufactured, but its damage is real. What drives someone to erase themselves from the world? And what happens when the lie becomes more permanent than death itself? In the chapters ahead, we'll follow a trail of staged disappearances, crafted in fear, in desperation, in darkness. Some vanishing acts were nearly perfect, others unraveled by a single clue, but all leave us with the same question. If death can be faked, what else can be? It started with a pile of clothes on a sunlit beach, November 1974, Miami, Florida. British Member of Parliament John Stonehouse steps into the Atlantic for an evening swim and never returns. His neatly folded clothes sit patiently on the sand, wallet, watch, shoes. It's a scene that says tragedy. A man lost at sea, a life cut short. But it was a performance, one meticulously rehearsed. Stonehouse was no ordinary politician. He was a former postmaster general, a rising figure in the Labor Party, but behind the public persona, the walls were closing in. Financial ruin, political scandal, whispers of espionage. With his reputation in shambles and prosecution looming, Stonehouse chose not to fight, but to vanish. Using the identity of a deceased constituent, he fled to Australia. New name, new bank account, new life, all constructed with care, like a novelist scripting his own second act. For weeks he lived as Joseph Markham, blending into Melbourne life as if he'd always been there. Back in Britain, the nation mourned. The press printed tributes. Parliament lowered its voice. His wife, Barbara, grieved for a man she believed the sea had claimed. But fate has a strange sense of irony. Australian authorities were hunting for another vanished Brit, Lord Lucan, suspected of murder. When they noticed a man making odd financial moves in Melbourne, they thought they'd found their suspect. But fingerprint analysis revealed something even more surreal. It wasn't Lucan. It was Stonehouse, very much alive. Exposed, Stonehouse was arrested and returned to the UK. The deception unraveled swiftly. Investigators uncovered a trail of forged identities, embezzled funds, and connections to foreign intelligence agencies. He had tried to rewrite his story, but instead he became its most unreliable narrator. He served 7 years in prison. His political career disintegrated. His family bore the weight of his choice. A vanishing act meant to escape shame had delivered only more of it. What kind of mind believes disappearing is better than facing the truth? Stonehouse's story is not just about a man who faked his death, it's about the fragility of identity. The ease with which someone can step out of a life and into another, as if people were costumes and the world a stage. He had the resources, the intelligence, the planning, and yet what brought him down was luck, or perhaps the lack of it. It leaves us with a haunting possibility. How many have vanished, not because they died, but because they chose to? And if identity can be forged so completely, how do we ever know who someone really is? It was the perfect storm of sky, speed, and silence. January 11th, 2009. Indiana skies are calm as Marcus Schrenker climbs into the cockpit of his Piper PA-46. A seasoned financial advisor, Schrenker tells air traffic control he's en route to Florida for business. 30 minutes into the flight, his voice cuts through the static. Cabin pressure failure, pilot incapacitated. Then silence. The plane flies on without him, heading south over Alabama, then Florida. Eventually, it crashes into a swamp near Milton, Florida, torn apart and burning in the dark. Emergency teams swarm the wreckage. No body is found, but the conditions are brutal, the area vast. Everyone assumes the worst. The news reports a tragic accident. A successful man taken too soon by mechanical failure. But the crash wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because Marcus Schrenker had already jumped, literally. He had parachuted out of his own plane, midair, disappearing into the wilderness like a magician vanishing behind a curtain. Days later, federal agents would discover what really happened. Schrenker's company was collapsing under fraud allegations. Millions missing. Clients betrayed. Lawsuits mounting. He wasn't flying to Florida. He was flying away from himself. He had planned it all, purchased parachutes, stashed a motorcycle in the woods, practiced survival techniques, stocked a tent with food, money, and fake IDs. He intended to vanish, resurface weeks later under a new name, and live out his life somewhere far from courts, clients, and consequences. But reality refused to cooperate. Radar analysis showed the cabin door opened mid-flight. Investigators found no blood in the wreckage. Then they found the hidden motorcycle parked exactly where his parachute path would have landed him. The illusion shattered. 2 days after the crash, they found him in a tent at a campsite in northern Alabama, wet, cold, alone. A man who had staged his death only to be found hiding from the world he once ruled. His arrest was swift. His trial, damning. He was convicted of securities fraud, aircraft tampering, and destruction of evidence, sentenced to more than 4 years in prison. A life once built on prestige, now reduced to infamy. What drives a man to leap from the sky and leave behind a burning lie? Perhaps it's the belief that death, or the illusion of it, offers cleaner closure than disgrace. Or maybe it's the fantasy that freedom lies just beyond the wreckage. Schrenker's story reveals something deeper, how illusion can momentarily triumph over reality. but not indefinitely. How desperation can craft a convincing fiction, but only for a time. Because even when the sky erases your trail, the ground always remembers. And in the end, every crash leaves a trail, not just in debris, but in truth waiting to surface. The note was short, 4 words, scribbled with finality. Suicide is painless. June 9, 2008, Bear Mountain Bridge, New York. Samuel Israel III, hedge fund manager and convicted fraudster, leaves his SUV idling near the railing. A suicide note on the dashboard, keys in the ignition. No sign of the man himself. He was due to report to prison that morning, 22 years for orchestrating a $450 million Ponzi scheme. But by afternoon, headlines read, "Financier jumps to death." And the Hudson River took the blame. Search teams combed the water for days. The river's currents were swift. The odds of recovering a body? Slim. Media coverage turned reflective. A tragic end for a man who once handled fortunes. Family and friends grieved. Even some investors, angry but human, paused to mourn. But Samuel Israel wasn't dead. He was parked in a motorhome just a few hours away, listening to the radio coverage of his own disappearance. Hidden in a Massachusetts campground, with cash, disguises, and a plan to flee the country. South America. Europe. Somewhere warm and distant, with no extradition treaties and no memories. His staged suicide was calculated, not impulsive. The car left in plain sight. The note, dramatic, a setup designed to buy time and sympathy. But lies, like bridges, don't hold forever. The unraveling began with a phone call. Israel, growing restless, reached out to his ex-girlfriend, asking for help acquiring fake documents. She went straight to the FBI. Within days, they tracked him down, alone in his RV, surrounded by maps, burner phones, and a fading dream of escape. Instead of freedom, he earned additional charges. His already long sentence grew longer, sympathy evaporated. The man who tried to rewrite the ending of his story had only deepened its tragedy. Samuel Israel believed death could be a clean break, that by vanishing into the river's myth, he could be reborn somewhere else. But he forgot that grief leaves footprints, that sorrow invites scrutiny. His case is more than a story of fraud. It's about how we measure the weight of guilt, how some, when cornered by justice, would rather vanish than face reflection. But even the deepest river can't bury the truth. And sometimes the most painful sentence isn't prison. It's living with the lies you hoped would set you free. What compels a man to fake death rather than face the mirror? Perhaps it's not the fall from the bridge that haunts, but the fear of looking down and seeing who you've become. He told his family he was going for a swim, July 2012, Jones Beach, Long Island. The sun hangs low, the Atlantic restless. Raymond Roth, a 47-year-old telecommunications worker, steps into the water while his wife and teenage son wait behind. He never comes back. Lifeguards search, police arrive. Boats and helicopters sweep the shoreline. The currents are strong, the evening light fading. By nightfall, hope gives way to acceptance. Another drowning. Another life quietly taken by the sea. His wife, Ivana, speaks through tears. His son, Jonathan, stands beside her, stunned. Insurance paperwork begins its slow procession. The community mourns. But Raymond Roth is not dead. He is driving south, alone, moving through back roads with cash in his pocket and a future built on disappearance. Financial pressure had closed in on him, debts, unemployment, the quiet panic of a life unraveling. Rather than confront it, he chose absence. Let the ocean do the explaining. For weeks, the story holds. Authorities assume his body was swept away. The sea, after all, keeps its secrets well. But grief can sharpen perception. Jonathan, unable to accept the finality, begins to search for answers online. He reads about staged drownings, about insurance fraud, about men who vanish and leave their families behind with only questions. What he finds unsettles him. Bank records don't add up. Withdrawals appear where there should be none. And then, a moment that changes everything, Jonathan sends a message to his father's phone. The phone that should be silent forever. It answers. Investigators trace the signal to South Carolina. They find Raymond Roth alive, living under a false name in a motel room. The ocean had not claimed him. He had simply walked away. The arrest is swift, the consequences irreversible. Roth is charged with fraud, but the deeper cost is invisible. His son, who uncovered the lie, carries a weight no teenager should bear. A father's absence is one kind of loss. A father's deliberate deception is another entirely. This case lingers because of who exposed it. Not a detective, not a forensic lab, but a grieving child who refused to believe that love could disappear so easily. Roth believed vanishing would spare him humiliation. Instead, it multiplied it. The debt he fled was financial. The debt he created was human. What happens when the person meant to protect you becomes the source of your deepest betrayal? And how does a family rebuild when the truth washes ashore long after the waves have gone quiet? The crash was messy, but the scene was too perfect. February 2013. A winding back road in Alabama. A motorcycle lies smoldering, twisted beyond repair. Scattered around it, a helmet, a wallet, a blood-stained jacket. It looks like a fatal accident. Locals slow their cars. Deputies tape off the area. The story writes itself. Clayton Daniels, 29, is presumed dead. He was a struggling construction worker, deep in debt, burdened by unpaid child support, and trapped in a spiral of mounting obligations. A life of small defeats, each one harder to outrun. So he tried something radical. Disappear. But not just disappear. Die. He chose a motorcycle crash because it fit his persona. A reckless road, a fast ride, a tragic end. The scene had all the ingredients, but something was off. Investigators noticed the blood. Too much, too dark. Tests confirmed their suspicion. It wasn't human. It was deer blood. Daniels had bought it from a butcher. From that moment, the crash became a crime scene. Accident reconstruction showed that the bike hadn't slid out naturally. It had been placed, then burned. Belongings were scattered by hand, not force. He hadn't been thrown from the wreck. He had walked away. Police traced connections, friends, family, a girlfriend. Just days later, they found him hiding out at her apartment less than 5 miles from the crash site, watching the news, laughing at the coverage, savoring his freedom, like a man who believed he had pulled off something brilliant. But it didn't last. Daniels was arrested and charged with insurance fraud and filing false reports. His attempt at escape hadn't solved his problems. It had multiplied them. What was once a case of unpaid bills was now a criminal trial. What had been a financial burden became a prison sentence. And the worst betrayal wasn't financial. It was personal. His mother had mourned him. His friends had cried. He had let them feel the depth of loss for a lie. This story isn't about brilliance. It's about desperation wrapped in illusion. Daniels believed a faked death could erase the weight of his past, but in trying to vanish, he left behind a trail of evidence that screamed louder than any goodbye. The lesson lingers. Staging your death isn't an escape, it's a trade. One set of consequences for another, harsher and more permanent. What is it that makes a person believe the only way out is to stop existing? And how much chaos can one illusion create when we mistake it for tragedy? It began with fire, not silence. A remote stretch of highway in Maryland. A car engulfed in flames. No body, no eyewitnesses. But the clues left behind tell a chilling story. A man, Benny Wint, has died in a tragic, fiery crash. His remains, investigators suggest, were likely consumed in the blaze. The report is filed. The death assumed. His wife files a $1.7 million life insurance claim. She cries. She waits. The money moves closer. But something doesn't feel right to the investigators assigned to the case, and soon that instinct proves true, because Benny Wint is alive. He's working construction in another state under a new name. The body never found, because no one died. The crash? Staged. The fire? Deliberate. The evidence, as it turns out, was built not to reveal truth, but to destroy it. Wint had spent months preparing. He knew how insurance worked, how bodies burned. He chose the location carefully, isolated, rural, far from scrutiny. The fire was intended to do what nature could not, erase a man entirely. But insurance investigators, trained to look past grief, start digging. They discover sightings of Wint alive. A man matching his description working under a different name. Surveillance confirms it. He's not just alive. He's thriving, waiting for the money to land. They follow the thread, and it leads them straight to him. The arrest is almost anticlimactic. The man who outwitted the fire couldn't outlast curiosity. Wint and his wife are charged with fraud. The claim is denied. The money never arrives. And the cost of the deception, legal, personal, emotional, becomes permanent. Why do people like Wint believe the world will accept a disappearance if it's loud enough? Maybe because fire feels final. It consumes. It purifies. It removes the possibility of questioning, but it also removes the evidence that would prove the lie. And when there's no body, there's always a question. Wint's story isn't unique, but it is revealing. It shows how fraud can wear the clothes of tragedy, how grief can be a disguise, and how people sometimes believe that if you burn the past, the future will forget. But ashes can whisper, and sometimes they tell the truth louder than flames. What if death isn't the end, but the start of a deeper kind of lie? It was supposed to be a fishing trip. The waters off Connecticut are quiet. A boat floats, half capsized, equipment drifting in the current. There's no sign of James Galante, a prominent figure in the waste management industry and a man under intense federal scrutiny. He is presumed drowned. The timing is suspicious. Galante's business empire was crumbling under the weight of a federal investigation. Allegations of racketeering, connections to organized crime, millions in questionable contracts. His world was tightening, and then, just like that, he was gone. The Coast Guard searches, but the water is deep, the current strong. Nothing is found. His family mourns. The media laments a life lost in the prime of scandal. Quietly, his business continues. Smoothly. Too smoothly. Because Galante isn't dead. He's hiding in a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, directing his empire remotely through encrypted messages and loyal intermediaries. His death was a strategy, a calculated attempt to erase his liability and let his associates retain control. He believed that in removing himself, the storm might pass, the charges might dissolve, and he could one day return to reclaim what remained. But investigators noticed something strange. Decisions were still being made that bore his unmistakable fingerprints. Business moves too precise, too familiar. Patterns that pointed to one inescapable truth. James Galante was still calling the shots. They followed the trail, coded emails, odd bank transactions, behavioral tells. Eventually, they found him. Hidden, but not gone. Alive, but not free. His capture reignited the investigation and added new charges: obstruction, fraud, conspiracy. Faking his death hadn't freed him. It had sealed his downfall. Galante believed disappearance was the ultimate escape, but vanishing without disconnecting proved impossible. His power was his weakness. It tethered him to the life he pretended to leave behind. His story is a portrait of ego and illusion. A man who thought he could beat the system by stepping outside it, only to discover that control leaves traces. It poses a modern question: can you ever truly vanish when everything you touch remembers you? And does disappearance mean anything if your shadow keeps making decisions in your name? It was meant to be a romantic getaway until he disappeared into thin mountain air. The Italian Alps. Dr. Mark Weinberger, a successful Indiana sinus surgeon, tells his wife he's going for a hike. He doesn't return. The search begins with urgency. Helicopters scan the cliffs. Rescue dogs comb the trails. Authorities suspect a tragic fall. The Alps are beautiful but unforgiving. His wife, devastated, returns home believing her husband is lost forever, a victim of nature's quiet cruelty. But Mark Weinberger wasn't lost. He was running. Back in Indiana, his medical empire was collapsing. Lawsuits from former patients, accusations of unnecessary surgeries, insurance fraud investigations, over $50 million in liabilities, and federal charges looming. Rather than face the reckoning, he vanished. His plan had been carefully laid. Before the trip, he moved money, acquired false documents, and charted a path through remote European villages. He became a ghost among stone houses and pine trees, surviving with cash and caution. But he wasn't invisible. Financial transactions left footprints. A few quiet purchases here. A medical supply there. Patterns began to emerge. International law enforcement agencies compared notes, names, faces, habits. Years passed. Leads thinned, then sharpened again. In 2009, they found him, in a tent, clinging to the side of a mountain near Mont Blanc, alone, weathered, hiding from the life he abandoned and the justice he tried to outpace. Weinberger was extradited and faced a litany of charges: fraud, malpractice, flight from prosecution. His medical license was gone. His reputation, dust. A man once celebrated for healing sinuses was now infamous for abandoning lives, including his own. What drove a man of medicine to become a fugitive of his own making? Maybe it was the belief that truth could be outrun, that the wild could offer sanctuary, that cold wind and distance could shield a man from responsibility. But mountains remember too. They hold echoes. They don't erase. They wait. Weinberger's fall wasn't from a cliff, but from grace. His story warns us, no matter how high you climb, in reputation, wealth, or literal altitude, if you abandon those who trusted you, the descent is inevitable. What kind of fear makes a healer choose silence over apology? And in the end, can anyone truly disappear in a world stitched together by memory, money, and consequence? The lake was cold, deep, and vast, the kind of place where things could vanish forever. Lake Superior. Hedge fund manager David Miller takes off in his private plane for what appears to be a routine business flight. Midway, the plane disappears from radar. No distress call, no survivors. Only twisted metal scattered across the water's icy surface. News breaks fast. A financial titan gone in a tragic crash. The SEC was circling his fund. Investors were whispering about missing money. But now, none of that matters. Miller is presumed dead. His story swallowed by the lake. But like the others before him, Miller isn't dead. He had planned the crash with chilling precision. He knew Lake Superior's depths would frustrate recovery, knew that aviation accidents often go unresolved when the body isn't found. He even knew how to fly just low enough to escape radar, and when to jump, parachute on, exit mid-flight, glide to the Canadian border with false documents and a bag of stolen money. He would become someone else, somewhere else. For a while, it worked. His hedge fund collapsed under scrutiny, but Miller was long gone, hiding just over the line in Canada, blending in, watching his name fade from the headlines. But the digital age doesn't forget. Border officials flagged his identity. Too clean, too perfect. A background check revealed it belonged to a recently deceased man. From there, it unraveled. Banking records showed financial activity linked to his old accounts. Purchases matched his habits. Surveillance filled in the rest. He was arrested, extradited, and charged with securities fraud, false reporting, and fleeing prosecution. His fantasy of a new life dissolved under the weight of his old one. Miller's plan was audacious, bold, but like every other vanished man, he underestimated the reach of the modern world. GPS, biometric data, international cooperation. The invisible net had grown too fine. His plane went down, yes, but so did his illusion. In the aftermath, his investors were left with broken lives and shattered trust. Not just because of the money, but because the man who had shaken their hands and promised security had chosen to vanish rather than make things right. Miller believed that by staging death, he could avoid disgrace, but all he avoided was responsibility, and only briefly. What does it say about a world where death feels like the safer choice than telling the truth? And how far will a person go to rewrite the ending, just to avoid being the villain in their own story? A man walks into the ocean and never walks back out. That's how the story usually begins. But in these tales of staged deaths, the real drama unfolds not in the moment of vanishing, but in the echo that follows. The 10 cases we've traced so far, from canoes to cliffs, bridges to burning cars, are more than just deception. They're reflections of something deeper. What unites them isn't just the lie. It's the desperation behind it. Each individual stood at the edge of their life, finances collapsing, reputations unraveling, prison looming, or simply the unbearable pressure of expectations unmet. And in that crucible, they didn't ask how to fix it. They asked how to escape it. Death became a door. But it was never an exit, only a hallway to another kind of prison, one built from lies, silence, and shadows. Because to live as a dead man is to be constantly hunted, not by police, but by memory, routine, digital footprints, and the unavoidable weight of guilt. In almost every case, the unraveling began with something small. A phone left on, a call placed in loneliness, a girlfriend with a conscience, a transaction that didn't belong. It was never a grand revelation, just one thread pulled from the fabric of illusion. And suddenly, the whole costume fell apart. The consequences were often worse than what the perpetrator had tried to avoid. Longer prison sentences, broken families, children who no longer spoke their names. And in every story, one truth emerged. Death was easier to fake than to maintain. We live in a time when footprints are no longer physical. Phones track us. Transactions remember us. Cameras see more than eyes ever could. Even identity, once changeable with a name and a passport, has become a network of data points too complex to escape. To truly disappear today would require not just leaving, but unexisting. And yet some still try, because hope, even when twisted, doesn't die easily. These stories remind us that people will go to impossible lengths not to be caught, not just by law, but by life itself. But here's the quiet tragedy. In every one of these cases, someone else suffered the loss. A wife left to mourn a man who hadn't died. Children grieving a parent who watched from afar. Friends who lit candles at memorials for the living. The illusion of death always casts real grief. So we're left with this question. Is it worse to lose someone forever, or to learn they chose to leave you behind? And what kind of world makes vanishing seem like the best way forward? The patterns repeat, not in the details, but in the choices: desperation, escape, reinvention, exposure. Each story in this strange gallery of staged deaths begins with pressure, financial collapse, public disgrace, criminal charges, and each ends in the same place: a man alone caught between the life he fled and the lie he built. But what makes these stories so compelling isn't just their audacity, it's how close they come to working. For a while, these men were gone, mourned, honored, freed from the consequences they feared. They watched their own funerals, read their own obituaries, hid in motel rooms or mountain tents while the world believed they were no more. They built new lives from ashes. But ashes, it turns out, are not a stable foundation, because sooner or later, real life knocks, in the form of an email, a financial transaction, a child who refuses to stop asking questions. In the digital age, the past is never really past. It's cached, indexed, available at the touch of a key or the flicker of a satellite. The illusion of disappearance is just that, an illusion. One wrong move, one familiar habit, and the mask slips. And yet, despite the odds, the fantasy endures. Maybe that's the most human part of it all. The desire to escape our own history, to disappear and start again, untethered by mistakes. To be forgiven not by others, but by erasing ourselves entirely. But real reinvention doesn't come from vanishing. It comes from facing the very things these men tried to outrun: accountability, change, humility. These fake deaths are cautionary tales not just of crime, but of human frailty. They show us how fragile our sense of identity really is, how it can be unmade with a forged passport, a sunken boat, or a staged crash. But they also show us something else, that behind every escape is a trail, not just of evidence, but of people, loved ones left with grief instead of truth, children holding on to ghost stories, friends remembering laughter that now feels hollow. The body might vanish, but the absence lingers. And so we ask, what do we owe the people who believe in us, even after we're gone? And how many false endings must we witness before we remember that facing the truth is still the bravest way to survive? It's easy to romanticize the idea of vanishing, a sudden absence, a neatly staged scene, a final note. The body never found, the world left wondering. But the stories we've followed, 10 men, 10 fake deaths, show that disappearance is never clean. It's messy. It's cruel. And it leaves behind more than unanswered questions. It leaves scars. There's a thread running through every case: the illusion of control. Each person believed they could rewrite the narrative, outmaneuver consequences, outsmart grief. They believed death could be a kind of freedom, a curtain drawn over shame, debt, or disgrace. But in seeking that freedom, they built prisons more confining than the ones they hoped to avoid. The canoe man, the vanishing MP, the hedge fund fugitive. Their names changed, their locations changed, but their burdens followed. Because no new passport can erase guilt, no remote cabin can silence memory, and no false death can make you truly disappear in a world that remembers everything. For every day they lived under new names, the weight of their deception grew heavier. Relationships disintegrated, loved ones turned to investigators. Lies compounded until the walls of their new lives cracked under the pressure. And when they were found, as they all were, the consequences were no longer just legal. They were deeply, profoundly personal. There's something especially heartbreaking about the betrayal these stories carry. Not just of banks or courts or clients, but of children, spouses, communities. People who mourned, who lit candles, who cried over graves that never held bodies. Grief in these stories is a tool, but it's also a wound. and the people left behind live with its phantom pain long after the truth surfaces. The real cost of a staged death isn't the sentence. It's the shattering of trust. The erosion of something sacred, belief in another human being. And yet, despite all this, we remain fascinated. Why? Perhaps because these stories force us to ask, what would I do standing on that edge? What secrets would I bury if I thought no one could ever find me? The men in these stories chose silence over confession, illusion over accountability. But each one learned the same lesson in the end. You can run from a lot of things, but not from yourself. And in a world lit by satellites, traced by data, and bound together by memory, even the deepest disappearance leaves a trail. The question is no longer, can you fake your death? It's, who will you become when you try? In the end, all roads return to the living. Every staged death we've explored began with an escape, a door slammed shut behind debt, shame, or the slow collapse of identity. But what we've uncovered is not just a catalog of deception. It's a mirror held to the quiet despair that lives beneath modern life. These were not masterminds. They were men, flawed, frightened, human, each convinced that the world offered no second chance unless they erased themselves completely. And for a brief, fleeting moment, many succeeded. The canoe washed ashore. The wallet lay on the bridge. The plane crashed. The boat drifted. The car burned. Death declared itself. Papers were filed. Tears were shed. Life moved forward without them. But death is not an empty space. It is a weight, a story others are forced to carry. And so, when the lie unraveled, as it always did, the damage was never just to the law. It was to memory, to love, to the fragile trust that binds one life to another. Sons learned their fathers had watched them mourn. Wives discovered their grief had been weaponized. Friends stood stunned, holding tributes to people still breathing. We often think of truth and lies as opposites, but these stories show they can coexist, layered like sediment, one on top of the other, until pressure reveals the fault lines. And through it all, one question echoes louder than any courtroom sentence or headline. Why is it easier to die than to be seen in failure? In a culture that prizes success, reinvention, and image above all, perhaps the ultimate transgression is not crime, but collapse. And perhaps deep down, these staged deaths reflect something we rarely admit, a yearning not to be punished, but to be forgiven without explanation. But forgiveness cannot be stolen, and rebirth cannot be faked. What these stories remind us, gently, painfully, is that the only way out of a broken life is through it, not around, not beneath, and never by disappearing. Because in the end, the greatest vanishing act is not death. It's the courage to remain, to face what we've done, to speak what we've hidden, and to be, however imperfectly, seen. That is where the real story begins, not with silence, but with truth. Hoi.